Friends, then it's my honor and privilege to be able to introduce our next speaker, Father Robert Spitzer of the Society of Jesus. He is president of the Magis Center of Reason and Faith in Orange County, California, and also the president of the Spitzer Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm not sure how he divides his time in the winter. These are vibrant and imaginative educational outreach initiatives, and they're tailor-made for the new evangelization on just the topics we have proposed for our discussion at this symposium. Father Spitzer's interest in education is neither recent nor passing. He is an educator's educator, having served as president of Gonzaga University from 1998 to 2009, also having held 2 endowed professorships, one at Seattle University and the second at Gonzaga. His success as a faculty member and teacher, both at Seattle and earlier at Georgetown, was recognized with teaching awards. And Father Spitzer received Gonzaga's University highest award in 2009, the Desmet Medal. Father Spitzer is one of those educator scholars that universities are always hoping they will attract. His scholarship on the status of physical time, on the intersection between physics, metaphysics, and the evidence for God from physics and philosophy has produced 5 books, including his award-winning New Proofs for the Existence of God, Contributions of Contemporary Physics and Philosophy. Father Spitzer has even taken his evangelizing, educating work to national TV. Larry King Live, the History Channel, the Today Show, PBS, and in many Catholic media venues. But friends, we don't have to turn on the TV to see him because he's right here. So please let's welcome Father Spitzer.
It's a real honor to be with all of you and a real illustrious group of people. And I'm not going to reiterate a lot of what Stephen said. I'm going to presume a lot of what Stephen Barr said in his talk. I'm going to try and orient my talk a little bit toward resources for high schools and college students. Essentially, the Magis Center tries to develop those resources, so we make things for high school students, both on the 9th and 10th grade level, also for the 11th and 12th grade level, those who have had a little bit of science, maybe some philosophy and logic training. We also work with the Focus Missionaries, that's a fellowship of Catholic University students, that go on various campuses throughout the United States. Most of them are pretty much secular campuses with strong campus ministries in them. And of course, these problems that I'll be talking about today come up during those talks. And during their attempts to get students on those campuses re-engaged. So this is really resources for college students, high school students, both on the 9th, 10th grade and the 11th and 12th grade levels. Just to jump to the point at hand, if we go to the slide that has the 4 major questions, we've been trying to do a lot of research at the Magis Center, and I'm going to leave all the sociology in part to Christian Smith tomorrow because it's what he studies. But what have we found are the knockout blows that really hurt the faith of our young students, both in high school and in college. And by the way, I shouldn't say just high school. I think Stephen Barr is correct. 7th and 8th grade is where it really begins to start. And these 4 questions begin to emerge even in the 7th and 8th grade. So it's you know, as Stephen said, it's never too early to begin, and 9th grade is never too early to start addressing the questions. But here are the big knockout punch questions. I mean, essentially, the Freudian question is the big one that people start with. That's the wishful thinking argument that Freud presented in Future of an Illusion, which has now taken on a myriad of popular forms, right? You know, God is wishful thinking, God has been made up, God is a crutch, take your pick. this is kind of the way that faith gets undermined initially within the school system. Might be by a professor, a teacher, a fellow student, several fellow students, whatever the case may be. But the wishful thinking argument does not work all by itself. Most students are not willing to buy it, not willing to say that faith is merely, a figment of their imagination for the purpose of wishful thinking, until they've investigated what the evidence is. So at least there's some critical thinking going on out there. And the students really will ask, maybe their parish priest, maybe another teacher, maybe the parents, whatever the case may be, is there any evidence for God? Is there any evidence for Christ? And that's where, when the wishful thinking argument gets accompanied by one of these 4 knockout punches, that's where we see the Pew survey data just start to be justified, fairly significant. Remember last year's Pew survey of the landscape of religion in America, where it shows that the rate of unbelief, which is, they call it nuns in the survey, N-O-N-E-S, that the rate of nuns is going up by 1% per year. So we've moved from 25% to 35% nuns in the 17 to 35-year-old age bracket in just 10 years. That's 1% a year. If we keep it up in the next 15 years, we're going to reach the astounding conclusion of Western Europe's current 50% unbelief rate in a mere 15 years. Because, of course, this is the younger generation. The believing generation, of course, is retiring and going to God, and the younger generation is coming in, and this rate needs to be addressed. Do Catholics get out of it? No, they don't. Catholics are basically subject. They're less inclined than a lot of Protestant sects, less inclined than Jewish people, but still Catholics, Mormons, evangelicals are still getting it. So they're still in the mix. They're just a little less in the mix than the average population. But what are the 4 knockout punches, at least to our mind, when we interview students? What's the vexing question? As John Cavadini just said, I've been in college education for a long time. I've heard a lot of people at 4 different universities talk about this. And number 1, absolutely number 1, is the question I'll be addressing in detail today. Essentially, this is how it is put to the students who believe it. Faith and science are contradictory, and as Stephen said this morning, science is truth, therefore faith must be a fantasy. If I have an authentic bone in my body, I better leave. So this is very vexing, very telling argument. The students are not just getting this, by the way, this false dichotomy between faith and science. They're not just getting in the classrooms or from fellow students, from peers and so forth. They're getting it big time on new media. I mean, I can't tell you, Dawkins has a very slick website. Hitchens used to have a slick website till he went home. But the key thing, though, is these guys have very, very telling arguments. There are many of them out there. They've mastered the 2 to 3 minute. I mean, Magis is just trying to catch up to put the 2 to 3 minute, whiteboard snarky videos on to try and counter what's going on in the media. But they are there, and the students, they spend enormous amounts of time on new media, just like our generation, but maybe before the TV. But the key thing is, this is the number 1 killer. You combine it with the wishful thinking argument, you're likely to get a student who starts to teeter and maybe even to fall into unbelief. The second one, which closely follows, by the way, this one, if you split up the world population into 3 groups in a facile way, let's say analytical proclivities, affective or emotional proclivities, or action proclivities, what's a person likely to do? Where do they process their information? What are they looking for, right? The first group that's getting killed with the science argument, that's more the analytical group. And there are people who take analytics seriously. Analytics doesn't have to be their primary way of dealing with information or decision making. Even if it's secondary, the science-faith dichotomy can be devastating. But for the affectives and the action-oriented people, the suffering one is a killer. Why would an all-powerful, all-loving God allow suffering? If he were all-powerful, he could prevent it. If he were all-loving, he would prevent it. Therefore, either God is irrelevant or he's unloving, in which case he's irrelevant, in which case, why should I believe? Instant unbelief with that group of affectives and action-oriented kids. So the one thing that we need to do is, you can't just tackle the faith and science. This one's out there, it's vexing. The other two arguments are much less so. But they can start trouble in conjunction with the wishful thinking argument, and that's the false dichotomy between virtue and freedom. Like I said, it's not as bad as false dichotomy between suffering and love, faith and science, but it is pretty bad. In other words, why should I, be virtuous or obey the rules of the Catholic Church? This is, I categorically reject, these rules because I have all kinds of friends who don't obey these rules, and they're really nice people. Now, what does nice people mean? We need to analyze it, right? They don't know why the 7 deadly sins are bad. Probably nobody's read Macbeth or something, and see, there's probably something wrong with out-of-control narcissism. Iago, and Othello, just to get the sense of envy, in the deepest, darkest way. I mean, Shakespeare is an expert if you want to learn about vice. But the key thing is they don't know. So that's another vexer. And then, of course, the fourth one is the historical reality of Jesus. There is just a program on the History Channel. I mean, the History Channel is good to me. They'll invite me on there to be a respondent, and so forth. I'll tell you one thing, though. Discovery Channel and Science Channel will not invite. PBS will. History Channel will. They're more balanced. But there are a lot of programs out there challenging the historical reality of Jesus. Every single evening, kids see it, and it's on the new media too. So this is a context, for the faith and science. What we're talking about is really, really important. It's not the only question of importance in this thing of unbelief. But as far as we can discern, these are the 4 knockout punches, with the first 2 coming in first and second, respectively. So if we go to the next slide really quickly. I think when we address the scientific argument, I'm just going to talk about what Stephen said just by way of repetition for just a second. I think it's really important for us to establish right away the horizons and the limits of science, so that in a respectful way, so that kids can pretty much see some of the more false arguments that have been adduced or actually presented in the new media. And one of the big myths that's out there is that science can disprove God. Well, it doesn't take much to show that that's a myth. As a matter of fact, if science is based on observational evidence, and observational evidence has to come from within our event horizon within the universe, and God is outside our universe, how in the world can science use observational evidence to disprove a reality which transcends the universe in principle? It can't be done. Now, this can be very easily explained, but a lot of students sucker for it right away. You mean science really did disprove God? Oh, yeah, I'm telling you, I know. Okay. And done. Before you even know it, their faith is fried. Secondly, just to go to the second argument there, I was on as John was just saying in the introduction, on the Larry King show, debating, with, actually Stephen Hawking wasn't part of the debate, but his partner, his co-author, Leonard Mladenov was, along with Deepak Chopra and a bunch of other things. But one of the questions that Stephen raised and forced the debate to go to is, does science really know everything about the physical universe such that science can now positively declare that the universe does not need a creator? This is what Stephen advocates. And I'm telling you, this is an impossible proposition. This is impossible to defend. So there are some scientists, I must tell you, who are not scientific realists. And this is the first one. Science is an inductive discipline, as all of you know. And an inductive discipline moves from particulars to universals. And when it moves from particulars to universals, it moves from specific observed data, and then, of course, it's linked together in a theory that's consistent, which shows that the empirical data can be explained by it in the most refined way possible. But a theory is a theory is a theory. And that theory is only reliant upon the particular observable data that has been discovered up to that time. This is the whole problem with induction. No scientist can know what he doesn't know or she doesn't know until he or she has discovered it. This is the problem with induction. We never know whether a theory is complete or comprehensive, because even though you think you might have discovered everything that there is to discover which could influence a theory, the next day you could be just as surprised as all of the Newtonians who got wiped off of the academic stage in one fell swoop with a mere couple of experiments. What my point is that Stephen does not have a right to make this claim. And students need to know this. Students need to know that this is not a coherent claim from the vantage point of scientific methodology. Science is an inductive discipline. On the other hand, we must subject everything that I'm going to say to the same caveat. So if I talk about the Bordelenkinen and Guth proof today, somebody could discover something that could obviate that or avert that, tomorrow, for all I know. I mean, it's a single condition proof. It's a very nice, a proof. The attempts to disprove it thus far, to get around it, I should say, thus far, have not really been physically realistic or significant, but nevertheless could happen because science is inductive. You can't make a deductive proof, can't make a proof for the existence of God in the same way metaphysics can make a proof for the existence of God. So that caveat is there. Nevertheless, as Stephen talked about just a moment ago, science can lean toward a beginning. And in fact, it can lean quite probabilistically toward a beginning, even when we consider some what I would call hypothetical scenarios, like a multiverse, or a multiverse of multiverses, or even a string universe, a higher dimensional space universe, right? In the higher dimensional space of string theory. Or as Stephen once put it in our Cosmic Origins documentary, the Steinhardt-Turok proposition, a bouncing universe on steroids. Essentially, even with all these fantastic things, as Stephen said this morning, science can still lean theoretically toward a beginning. So I'm just going to take a quick thought, and I'm going to just talk about one thing that Stephen said at the end. And with all deference, Stephen's been incredibly helpful. He's the narrator and just probably the back producer of our documentary called Cosmic Origins. He's helped me enormously on this chapter 1 of this book that I wrote and so forth. But I just will say this one thing about the connection between physics and metaphysics in the next slide, where can science give evidence for a creator? You have to respect all the caveats that Stephen talked about, but I think that science can do this. Physics can't do metaphysics, but science or physics can open the door to metaphysics. I do think that is possible. Now, I'm sure I'll get some good questions in the aftermath about this, but I'm just going to make a quick assertion here. And the assertion is that if science could ever show the beginning of physical reality itself, has it? No. Is it getting closer and closer to getting a bigger and bigger context for a beginning even of a multiverse or a multiverse of multiverses, etc.? Yes, it is getting closer, but it hasn't come to the point of showing a beginning of physical reality. But if it could, and that's a big if, we have to make that very explicit. Science is only leaning in there, not there. But if it could, then prior to that point, the universe, including time itself, making, of course, the statement prior, a bit oxymoronic, would be nothing. And here it is, and here's just my one thought as a metaphysician. I do not think that having a creator create a universe out of nothing subjects God to a horizontal causation series. Because If that were the case, miracles would subject him in the same way, or the incarnation could subject him in the same way. I think you can actually vertically create, and you have to vertically create the universe if you're going to create time itself, because there is no horizontal series to connect into if there's no physical time, and physical time must be created. And I do hold that physical time is something real and would have to be created along with the mass energy of the universe. So what's the point that I think is useful for students? If, and you have to have the caveats elucidated, but if the universe, if physics, or physicists or science or whatever we want to call it, could show that there must be, or somehow lean probabilistically toward a beginning of physical reality itself, if then, prior to that beginning, using that term only in the illustrative sense of something which didn't exist, if prior to that beginning the universe was nothing, and we insist that nothing is truly nothing, and Stephen has written eloquently about this, in that wonderful First Things article called Much Ado About Nothing. But the point is if nothing's really nothing, then the only thing nothing can do is nothing. The age-old metaphysical proposition that from nothing only nothing comes actually holds, because physical reality itself is nothing, and therefore it cannot move itself from nothing to something when it's nothing, because the only thing it can do is nothing because it's nothing. Now, you think about that for a moment, and really it's almost tautological. Students do not have difficulty grasping that if you give the proper caveats. And of course, then they say, well, what do you mean something transcending space and time? What do you mean something transcending physical reality? And then I just say, well, that's what I call God. That's what I'll just call God. Now, you can mesh that in with a philosophical proof of God, in which case you have a complementary, a deductive approach, like Lonergan's proof that Stephen alluded to in chapter 19 of Insight, right? If being is completely intelligible, then God exists. But being is completely intelligible, therefore God exists. An unrestricted active understanding exists. Okay. Now, if you can show all the steps of that deductive argument, you do have a complementary proof. Will this work for high school kids and most college kids? No. Therefore, my one thought is, just for the time being, just simply say for a second, if we can really isolate a trans-physical power creating the whole universe as a single unit, right, or a multiverse, or a multiverse of multiverses, or a string universe, right, in the higher dimensional space of string theory, whatever it may be, that creates the whole of physical reality at once, then I think you get to the point where you really are looking at some kind of a metaphysical implication of physics. As I said, physics hasn't arrived there yet, but it is leaning in that direction. I'll talk about 3 reasons for it in just 1 second. I think the reason there is so much paranoia about the term nothing in the current physical literature is because the implications of creation are really out there. I think, you have a person like Alexander Vilenkin, he's one of the partners who has the BVG theorem for a beginning, right? It's Arvind Borda, Alexander Vilenkin, and Alan Guth, 3 actually really sharp physicists. Alexander Vilenkin is one of them, and he turns right around and says, yeah, there has to be a beginning. There even has to be a beginning of an inflationary, multiverse. There even has to be a beginning of, string multiverses and so forth. And, he's basically backing the physics community into a corner. And then he goes on in his 2006 book, Many Worlds, he says, well, it is said that a good argument will convince a reasonable person, and a proof will convince even an unreasonable one. Well, now that the proof is in place, namely the Borda-Vilenkin-Guth proof we'll talk about in just a moment, there is no possibility for cosmologists to hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They must confront the reality of a beginning. the same guy will turn right around and say, but wait a minute. Prior to the beginning, I know it looks like it's nothing, but nothing is really something. So now we have tunneling from nothing. That's Vilenkin's theory. Stephen Hawking has a theory. Actually, Stephen Hawking has two big ones, one of which is it's the law of gravitation that does it. That's nothing. But in fact, that's just physically nothing. If it's really a law and it exists, it's not nothing. And presumably, if it's a law that exists without a physical reality to accompany it, it's in a mentative state. And if it's in a mentative state, it begs the question of in whose mind? So the point, of course, is the nothing stuff is really important. And it manifests, I think, a real metaphysical threat to physicalism today. And it's coming out of physics. And the people who are most threatened seem to be some of our best physicists, one of whom, anyway, is a staunch advocate of a beginning of not only our universe, but of multiverses. So let's just take a look. On our next slide, you see this triangle. And the key thing is I'm just going to go through three kinds of evidence that really work for some kids, and I'm going to add a fourth one. But if you really want to, basically our Reason series for the 9th and 10th grade, this is designed to be fit into the Bishop's curricular framework in about a week and a half to 2 week period for the freshman and sophomore year. It's called the Reason series. But I mean, we have to get to the evidence fast because a lot of teachers are not going to integrate it, first of all, into the course. They're not going to start an entire course in their curricula. If you're going to get it in to a lot of the schools, I've got a method which I'll talk about, employing some of the science teachers to come in. I can give them talks, in what's called webcasting, things like that. Have the science teachers help the religion teachers so they don't get intimidated, etc. But you need it snappy. You have to get it done because I think there are a lot of teachers out there who will not step out of the Bishop's curricular paradigm. Maybe they shouldn't, but at the same time, it has to be pretty quick, unless you're going to start an elective course in the senior year, in which case I have a whole different solution. I think the same, let me just explain what we're doing. What are some of the ways that you can get the kids' attention to some of the physical theories that Stephen alluded to earlier? I think one of them is space-time geometry proofs, and the Borda Vilenkin and Guth proof is probably the best one. This is a 2003 proof proposed by Arvind Borda, who used to be at the Kavli Institute, just north of me at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Alan Guth, who still holds the chair of cosmology there at MIT, and Alexander Vilenkin, who I was just talking about, who is the director of the Institute of Cosmology for Tufts University, came together and put together a proof which has a single condition for a beginning of any universe, multiverse, or frankly, any universal system that meets this one condition would have to have a beginning. And the condition simply is that, that the universe or multiverse be expansive. So it must have a rate of expansion, or a rate of Hubble expansion greater than 0. So the rate of expansion of the universe as a whole has to be greater than 0. And of course, that's an easy kind of a criterion or condition to meet. And all multiverses must be expansive because really you can't have a multiverse outside of an inflationary condition. And the same thing with the so-called eternal inflation hypothesis. So this has a vast applicability. Does it apply to the whole of physical reality? We don't know. But one thing we know is it has a vast applicability, and the attempts to try and get around it have been very, very difficult indeed, physically unrealistic. I mean, you basically have to have, some weird, de Sitter space condition in which time is going backwards while the other side of de Sitter space is time is going forwards, and so forth and so on. And these are things that are pretty problematic. Stephen has really criticized the Hawking-Hartle models and things of that nature. But the one thing, though, that I think is really clear is that if you want some telling evidence from physics, this is a good one. It has vast applicability, and it also is very difficult to disprove. But one other advantage, not but and one other advantage, and that advantage is you can put it out in logical form. You don't have to have a math form of it. And Alexander Vilenkin did everybody the favor by, in many worlds, he put it into a logical form, which basically has 6 steps. And in this other video, I don't do this in the 9th and 10th grade video, but in this one, From Nothing to Cosmos, God and Science, I do put it in there. But if you want during the Q&A, just ask me and I can give you the 5 steps very, very quickly. So that's a first one, and it tends to really rivet the student's attention. And they'll try, it's great. You get a great dialogue, because once they understand the 6 logical steps, right, you could actually reduce it to 5 logical steps, if you assume one. The key thing is these kids they're already trying to get around it. They're thinking through it. They're engaged by it. So it's a useful tool that gets them going. The second one is the entropy argument. There are many ways of trying to obviate entropy today, but still, there is the inconvenient fact that, all physical systems that we know of are subject to an ever-increasing amount of disorder. And if you have more and more and more disorder within a physical system, it can do less and less and less activity and work. And for all intents and purposes, at the end of the day, if your universe has been around for an infinite amount of time, or your physical system been around for an infinite amount of time, and it's been doing some work during that time, some activity during that time, then eventually it's going to get to a place of being completely disordered, completely run down. It's going to be at what they call heat death, and then it's not going to be able to do anything. But our universe isn't like that at all. As John Polkinghorne says in our documentary Cosmic Origins, well, it seems to me that, there's hot stars and there's cold space. And he goes through about 15 things in this litany, and at the end of it, he sort of says, we're nowhere near thermodynamic equilibrium. As a matter of fact, there's plenty of order in the universe, which is telling. And it is. The point, of course, is, can kids get this without a lot of math? Yes, they can. And I think, again, this is another very good little tool. Again, the entropy arguments, there's many attempts to try and get around it, but there is that one inconvenient fact. If we've been around for an infinite amount of time, Sean Carroll notwithstanding, we should be at maximum entropy, and that would mean no activity going on in the universe, which is quite distinct from the universe we know. Stephen mentioned many of these fine-tuning coincidences, and I think those are good ones. I think they're good ones for high school kids. He called it anthropic coincidences, and I think that's exactly. Anthropic just means a tendency toward not only a living organism, but a living organism that eventually can give rise to an intelligent life form. So that would be an anthropic universe. An anthropic coincidence would mean one that is tending in the direction toward life and intelligent life. So he gave, the one about, the strong nuclear force constant, et cetera. You raise that 2%, and of course, all you have is hydrogen. You have no hydrogen, You lower it 2%. You have no element heavier than hydrogen. The whole universe is hydrogen. Kids get it. You don't have, they go, is this for real? And you go, here you go. Here are the sources. And that's good enough. They don't have to understand, all the physics behind the constants. Again, if Paul Davies and Brandon Carter and all these guys are correct, then if you raised or lowered the gravitational constant or the weak force constant by only 1 part in 10 to the 50th from their actual values at the Big Bang, that's a decimal point, 49 zeros and a 1, which is a really small window of opportunity. Either one of those two constants, higher or lower, either the universe would have been completely explosive and continuous explosive in its expansion, which would be very bad for life forms. Or alternatively, the universe would go, literally collapse into a black hole, crushing the entire mass of the universe into 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, which is really bad for life forms. The point is, you mean we averted complete disaster by those constants heading straight on by 1 part in 10 to the 49th at the Big, 1 part in 10 to the 50th at the Big Bang? Yeah, we did. Do you believe that happened by pure chance? I just asked the kids. They go, well, do you think it could happen? Well, not without a multiverse. I mean, that's like the monkey basically typing Macbeth by random tapping of the keys in a single try. But I mean, the one I think that really hits the students between the eyes is the Penrose number. They really have a great deal of difficulty trying to get away from it. Basically, what Sir Roger Penrose that Steve mentioned this morning, what he basically calculated was the odds against low entropy at the beginning of the universe. Now, low entropy is very desirable for life because you want a certain amount of order to be in the universe so that you can not only have an ordered universe, but one that can do work and activity that can develop, that can give rise to life forms and allow life forms to be maintained and to evolve and so forth. So the key thing that I think really gets the kids right between the eyes is that Penrose number. The odds of having our low entropy at the Big Bang that we have in our universe is 10 raised to the 10 raised to the 123 to 1 against. That's a double exponent. If you reduced it to a single exponent, it'd be a 10, and then in the exponent, a 1 with 123 zeros following it. That's a trillion in the exponent. If you were to write that number, our solar system would not hold that number if every zero were 10-point type. That's worse than the monkey typing the entire corpus of Shakespeare by random tapping of the keys in a single try. So the only way to think that this is going to happen in our universe in a single try is preposterous. There's only one way out, and that is you have to postulate an immanentist metaphysics. That is to say, a metaphysics that can stay within the sphere of the natural physical world. And what is that? It's a multiverse. As Stephen said this morning, every known multiverse hypothesis has a lot of fine-tuning in its initial parameters and conditions. I mean, one that was done by Albajetti and Leaf, which is a great work, had to do with Andre Linde's, chaotic multiverse. And of course, in order to get the bubble universes to not collide or interfere with one another, which, by the way, would be very bad for life forms, essentially, you have to put in a slow roll condition at the beginning of that universe. And the slow roll condition requires a lot of fine-tuning, highly, highly improbable. So essentially, if this continues to happen, that no multiverse model can be developed, which does not itself require fine-tuning, all we have effectively done is moved the anthropic problem back one step. All we've done is move the fine-tuning and the improbability of fine-tuning problem back one step, and that's to the multiverse itself, which of course means, well, did God do that too? Did a superintellect do that too? So I think these are three things that really do speak to the students. We can put them out very nicely here. I think it does three things for the kids when you get to the evidence right away. Number one, for the kids in the class who are on the brink of either atheism or thinking, I better not go on for a career in science if I am a believer, or I better not believe anymore if I'm going on for a career in science. Those kids, that whole top lot of kids, you can finally give them some relief. And then you can go and give them a bunch of stuff that they can go read in Stephen Barr's book or my book or a variety of other books, or actually to the actual sources themselves, in physical review letters if they're capable of doing it. So it really does do that. Number two, there are a lot of people out there who are just looking for any ammo they can give to people who are their adversaries. I mean, there are English teachers out there who are saying, don't you know science has disproved God? And of course, wouldn't it be great to just say, well, how do you respond to the Board of Lincoln and Guth proof, just for starters? And then while you're at it, how about some of those anthropic coincidences we've been hearing about? Could you talk about that in the English class too? They're not going to do that because they don't know any more in many respects than Richard Dawkins does what this is. And that's a fact. So we do need to arm those kids with something. We can't let them go on and be the Polish cavalry riding out to meet the German panzers. They're getting mowed down. And I've seen it a million times on different college campuses. I just finished a tour of Harvard, MIT, Columbia, just going right down the East Coast there. It's been wonderful. These kids come up to me afterwards and they go, holy smokes, give me all your references. And I have a reference sheet. I just hand it out. They're going to go and they're just going to, bury themselves in it, and all the better. Let me point out a fourth piece of evidence before I get to the whole area of some of these tools that we can use and so forth. There's a fourth piece of evidence that I think is very, very telling, that helps the kids a lot, both high school and college. What Stephen was saying today about quantum theory and about Gödel's theorem, that's right on the marker. And there are a lot of kids in college who can get that. They understand that quantum theory presumes consciousness, and therefore, consciousness has to be antecedent to quantum theory, not vice versa, right? In other words, quantum theory doesn't explain consciousness. Quantum theory presumes it. And there's a big mistake out there that Stephen is redressing in his work. But there has to be some kind of mind. I mean, even if you just take von Neumann's paradox seriously, that must be presumed in the workings of quantum mechanics, which is why so many physicists actually believe that consciousness is independent of classical physical systems. Just a thought. So that's the first thing. And I think Stephen's right about Gödel's theorem, too. I think this is a very persuasive argument, particularly for people who understand the nature of proof and see, of course, that even the simplest arithmetic, proofs, with the corrections and the creation of those proofs is going to require something beyond the algorithms themselves. I think this is very persuasive. But I know I tread lightly here, but I'm going to just say these words: near-death experiences. Ever since Dr. Eben Alexander's book has come out and has reached, basically New York Times, whatever list for how long. Ever since that book came out, Proof of Heaven, this is on the students' minds. You present that, and no matter what you think about Eben Alexander, he was monitored during the entire time. He was dead. He knows what he saw. He has, come to faith. But it's not just he. Dr. Pim van Lommel in The Lancet, which is Britain's, #1 medical journal, has published a very fine study in 2001 where he did that over an 11-year period at 10 different European hospitals and shows the same thing. Dr. Kenneth Ring's study is a very good study. where he shows 80% of blind people, this is significant for me, 80% of blind people see during clinical death. Most of those blind people were blind from birth. So we're talking about now, right, a person who's claiming that he's left his or she's left her body, right, and they can still see, they can hear, they're reporting what's going on, they've got veridical data. Do you know there was a tennis shoe on the ledge of the hospital out there on the 5th floor ledge? How do you know if it's outside of the hospital? I was out there, passed right through the wall, I saw that tennis shoe. By the way, that shoelace is sticking right under the heel there. It's very funny because the left toe is worn out, and that's the only thing. It's the exact correct description of the shoe outside the hospital. Now, how do blind people do this, let alone sighted people, when they are clinically dead with a flat EEG, fixed and dilated pupils, and no gag reflex? The kids, they see the significance. They absolutely see the significance. Now, of course, there are people who are New Agers, and there are all kinds of people who use this, and they have their own agendas, totally. But why would we let them use this evidence and not let ourselves use this evidence? Because no matter what, the kids are looking at this evidence. We as Catholics can't say that the evidence is being misused by this group, therefore we shouldn't use it. It is exceedingly effective for both high school and college kids. There are really great studies out there from JAMA Journal done by Dr. Melvin Morse. Great studies, Dr. Pim von Lommel, Dr. Kenneth Ring, done in Lancet. They're right that this new Dr. Eben Alexander, was a neurosurgeon over there at Harvard and then the University of Virginia now and so forth. So the key thing is, I think there are 4 kind of interesting ways in which either medical science or physics can at least open the door to metaphysics. The concluding part of Eben Alexander, he got attacked by some of his fellow physicians, for believing in this stuff. And at the end of it, he just says, the evidence is so overwhelming. I can tell you right now that in 20 years, physicalist views of consciousness will be over. The basis of consciousness is not going to be in physicalist means what Steve was calling materialistic reductionism this morning. It's not going to be in physicalism. It's going to be in some kind of trans-physical domain. So these are things that are important, not only so that the students see, hey, maybe I do have a soul which will survive bodily death, but to see that the door to metaphysics is opening wider and wider. I think the quantum paradox that Steve pointed out today is very, very important. I think Gödel's theorem, for those who can understand it, is very important as well. It's good complementary data. What's my point? You have to get to the evidence. And you have to get to the evidence right away before you answer the other things. The God question and the soul question and the metaphysical question is on the line. And our students, if they're buying into a physicalist viewpoint, they're not going to listen to the answer to the other questions. But boy, if you answer those questions, I can tell you what the class will do in 1 second. They'll ask 4 other questions because now it's germane. Question number 1, what about the church and evolution? Do you realize that upwards, certainly more than 25% of our kids in high school think that the church is against evolution? I kid you not. We've been caricatured so much on the Science Channel that these kids, and in the new media, that the kids actually, they have no idea that there was an encyclical called Humani Generis way back in, 1952? Going all the way back to Pope Pius XII, which basically allows Catholics to believe in any scientifically verifiable part of evolution so long as they don't deny a unique creation of a soul. I mean, John Paul II's letter to the Papal Academy of Sciences just puts the whole question to rest about the Catholic position on evolution. I mean, these are fantastic. I just show them to the kids. I go, whoever's telling you this either doesn't know what they're talking about or they're lying to you. And these kids go, oh, okay, you know. But the key thing is, high school or college, there is profound ignorance on the church's position in evolution. Secondly, there really is profound ignorance on the Bible and science. I mean, honestly, there are a lot of people out there who still believe that the Catholic Church holds the dictation theory of inspiration. I'm not kidding. This is a huge presupposition in the culture, which essentially means, right, that God, is speaking to this person in 5th, 6th century BC, in Jerusalem, and he's telling him word for word about the creation of the universe. So we have to really get a pretty sophisticated hermeneutic in there to help the students out, which basically says that God works with the biblical author. The biblical author has to use his own categories, his own brain, his own, cultural disposition, because his audience is of that ilk, right? Whatever is received in the manner of the receiver. So you can't have God saying, in the beginning, there was a string theoretical configuration of 11 dimensions in M theory, which, of course, strips off the gravitational force, becomes the space-time field, and then leaves, this grand unified, strong force, weak force, electromagnetic force, in which the strong nuclear force peels off, and just fractions of a second later, the electro-weak force turns into the and then it goes through a Higgsian field and takes on mass and so forth. Who's going to understand this? This is not possible, because as Pope Pius XII said in 1952, let science be science, and let, the Bible be the Bible. The purpose of the Bible is to present sacred truths necessary for salvation. It is not to give an explanation, a natural explanation of the universe. So essentially, I think this is really important. And then just go through Genesis 1. So what are the sacred truths in Genesis 1? The poor biblical author, right, facing Gilgamesh or whatever, he's got to deal with many gods versus one God. As Cardinal Willett was saying last night. He's got to deal with gods, who are like the river god and the sun god. They're nature gods. He's got to show that these are all creations of God. He's got to show that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, have the divine dignity. They're not just cannon fodder and playthings for the gods. So he's got to deal with all these truths of salvation, which is so necessary for salvation. But really, they're not that important. There's some incredible coincidences, like let there be light. Wow, there's a thought. Where did he come up with that one? But there's some real coincidences in that story. But the thought is, it doesn't have to be a naturalistic explanation. I hate to say this, but the third big question that will come up is aliens. And truly, there's so many shows on aliens now, and new media is filled with aliens. The key thing, though, you have to deal with, again, is the misconception that the Catholic Church is against aliens. So you got to say, well, where did you come up with this? My friend assured me of it, But, of course, you got to come back around and just simply say, look, intelligent life is highly improbable. But, could it happen if you have 10 to the 22nd stars and 10 to the 11th galaxies out there? Could you get it? Of course you could get a life form. Could one develop into an intelligent life form like my dog Fido? Sure, it could. Could it develop into a human life form? And here's where I draw the line. And I basically say, I'm not sure yet what the natural paradigm or the physical paradigm is that can actually violate Gödel's theorem. In other words, where you can actually get something that can be beyond the algorithms which controls it from a physical system. That's a tough one. And then I tell them, when you get right down to it, these near-death experiences, I'm beginning to, and then I go into Plato's 5 transcendentals, or the Platonist 5 transcendentals, truth itself, goodness itself, beauty itself, love itself, and being itself. And I try to go through and say, that's what you really desire, as Bernard Lonergan said, when animals run out of biological opportunities and dangers, they don't go into the transcendentals. You stop petting the dog, giving the dog affection, giving the dog food. Don't threaten the dog. When all biological and instinctual opportunities and dangers run out, the animal simply falls out of its state of conation and falls asleep. Human beings don't. We think about what we don't have in love and we want more. We think about what we don't have in justice and goodness and we want more. When we run out of biological opportunities and dangers, we want more beauty, more goodness, more justice, more love, etc. And so I just say, what is it about you that's different from my dog? Who I like my dog. I don't want to disparage my dog. But he does fall asleep. As if the full-time occupation of the dog is to sleep with occasional opportunities which arise from biological and environmental stimuli that awaken it so that these things can be taken advantage of in an economical and efficient way. That's what I think. We're not that. So the kids, right? So when you present, I think, all four of the arguments, the quantum argument, the Gödel argument, the transcendental argument, and the near-death experience argument, then when you get to the alien having life or intelligence like human beings have intelligence, I simply say, I have no way of explaining this unless God gave that alien an individuated soul. Now, is that possible? Sure. I cannot read God's mind. I can't tell you that God wouldn't do that. And of course, the question that the students are going to shoot back at you with almost instantly. Well, was Christ's redemptive act good enough for the whole universe? And I say, yeah, it's just as good enough for the whole universe as much as when the missionaries discovered the New World, it was still good enough for the missionaries, even though it happened incarnately in Israel in the first century. Of course it's good enough. Could God have something else going on? God can do all kinds of things that are completely beyond my imagination. But aliens, they're possible. Wouldn't surprise me if God surprised me. So for all intents and purposes, I think these are the questions you're going to get, almost immediately. And Stephen already raised the big one, Galileo. And then why has the church picked on science these many years? And of course, the answer to the question is they haven't. The church has been contributive to the very foundations of science. Indeed, priests have been very contributive to the foundations of science these many years. And by the way, Father Georges Lemaitre was so humble. I couldn't have been this humble. He sat there when Edwin Hubble was getting all the credit and said nothing, even though he had published all of his findings 3 years before, and the only mistake he ever made was publishing in a Belgian journal instead of an English one. And he said nothing. God help me, I'd love that. I would love that humility, but I do not have it. But the long and the short of it is, are there resources? We could flip just really quickly. At the Magis Center, of course, you have Chris Bagelow's book, which Stephen mentioned today. That's a very good resource. It's really good. It goes right into the church issues. It goes, and we do the Galileo issue in this Reason series as well. It's a very, very good book. This one is your short and sweet. This is called the Reason series. I put a little brochure out there, and if you need some more brochures, just come by afterwards. I've got some business cards here too. You can have them after the talk. I know you got to get on the buses and everything, but I'll leave some additional ones out. But the key thing is there's a description of some products. This Reason series, I think, is a very good product. And was it on the next slide? Yeah. So you might want to take a look at this one. It's meant for 9th and 10th graders. It's a dramatization, right? Because, this kid goes to college. His roommate, Tyler, right, just beats him up on his blog every day, calling him church boy, naive, idiot, so forth and so on. Help me out, folks. Redress this poor sap, And of course, they've heard every one of Tyler's arguments. By the time they're in the 10th grade, this is not just about college. The high school kids have already heard Tyler's rantings. And so the fact is, when they hear it, they go, wow, you're. And then, of course, he meets these two guys, Dan and Elena, a PhD candidate in physics and philosophy, respectively, and they take him through the evidence for God from physics and philosophy. We put one other thing in there, in addition to the things that I've spoken of: evolution, aliens, Bible and science, BVG proof, abortive Lincoln goof proof, entropy, anthropic coincidences, and so forth. We put in the necessity for Jesus into it as well. So we have 6 questions that lead them from a creator to the importance of Jesus. And I got these 6 questions a long time ago from a physics kid who went on when I was teaching at Georgetown. He was a physics student. He came on the retreat, and he comes. And he wanted me as director, and so he says, hey, Father Spitzer, I'm glad I got you the director. I said, oh, great. He says, I do have a big question. I said, well, what is it? He says, look, I really don't have a whole lot of much of a problem with the creator. If general relativistic considerations proceed back to a singularity or something fundamental like it, I really do think there probably have to be some causative force outside of space-time asymmetry and maybe outside of physical reality itself. I said, well, that's great. So what's your problem? In other words, he believed in a creator, right? And I said, so what's your problem? And he goes, it's the Jesus thing. I don't get it. So why is he significant? I mean, if you can intellectually rationally see some evidence for God, well, why do you need Jesus? And of course, it's the whole idea of Jesus' revelation of God as unconditional love, right? And you these 6 questions take the student through, what's your most important power? Is it your creativity, your intellect, or your love? What's going to be the most positive of your powers, right? And of course, Steve would say, well, I know it's not my intellect. I could use that for evil. Good. Okay, what else are you looking at? He goes, is it love? Yeah, okay, let's go with love. Hey, Steve, do you think that the creator you just admitted to could be anything less than love? Well, couldn't he, would he be completely devoid of love? And of course, Steve goes, well, probably not if it's my most positive power. Okay, good. Is the only thing you want, just some love or concrete love, or do you really want unconditional love? And of course, Steve, he's thinking about it for a while. He's thinking about it. He goes, I know this. I don't want unconditional love. I've learned unconditional love is an impossibility. I said, oh, yeah? Would you ever break up with a girlfriend or something because you just found out that she was finite and she got stressed and tired? She just wasn't responsive enough, understanding enough, intelligent enough, home enough. She just wasn't the one. And you got disgusted and broke up with her. And he looks at me and he goes, I did that a few months ago. I said, well, what were you looking for? Unconditional love? Maybe. And you were trying to extract it out of that poor finite being. You're going to pull God out of this finite conditioned being. And he's looking at me and he goes, keep going. I said, okay. I said, well, if God, the God, your creator, you just admitted could be love in some sense. Do you think he'd be devoid of unconditional love in some sense? And he's capable of that kind of empathy? If he were unconditional love? He goes, maybe he's capable of unconditional. I said, well, if you desire unconditional love, maybe he is capable of creating you with that desire. Okay, let's go to the next question. If God really is unconditional love, do you think he'd want to be with you peer-to-peer, face-to-face, in a perfect act of empathy because he loves you perfectly and wants to show you perfectly in your own form what love is like in the perfection of the Father? Do you really think, do you think that God, it'd be typical of God to be unconditional love? Bingo, this kid goes, I get the Jesus thing. But the same holds true. You don't have to be a graduate student in physics. You don't have to be a college student. High school kids get the 6-step argument. And once they connect Jesus in with the idea of the unconditional love of God with us, it's a very important thing. So we do put it into the Reason series because many times the teacher has to make the connection to Jesus from a creator. So that's basically this one. We have faculty resource manuals that work with this, where everything is explained, all the questions are answered, etc. We also have an online forum that has 3 retired physicists and 2 retired philosophers and 1 active philosopher who are answering questions on the online forum to any teacher or student who wants to do it. We try to get the answer out within 24 hours so that the students don't feel like they're all by themselves. Okay, and then for the 10th, 11th, and college, we have this one called From Nothing to Cosmos, God, and Science. This also, too, has a study guide and so forth with it. You can get on the online forum to get answers to your questions about it. It is designed, though, to be basically a 4-week course in the senior year as part of an elective. I do think if you're going to start an elective course, Chris Bagelow's book would be very good, and he'll talk to you tomorrow, right? And then I think on the panel. And then I think this would be very, very helpful if you just want to get to the evidence. This one goes deeper into the argument. So you get the 5 steps of the Bordovich-Guth proof. You get the 5 steps of the entropy argument. But also, more importantly, this one has the response to Richard Dawkins on it. And the kids, they do know the God delusion, the central argument of the God delusion. A lot of them have heard of it. That any designer would have to be more complex than anything he designed. And, of course, complexity is more improbable. Therefore, any designer would have to be more improbable than anything he designed. And, of course, these kids are vexed. They're absolutely vexed by it because they go, yeah, how can you answer that? Well, as you probably know if you read The God Delusion, right, Dawkins does a very perfunctory criticism of St. Thomas Aquinas, demonstrating he might not have even read anything beyond maybe a Copleston page or 2. I don't know. But, it's really perfunctory. It's not really a good faith deal. Nevertheless, you can, in a 5-step argument, you can just show St. Thomas's notion of simplicity, where you basically point out that an uncaused cause is going to have to be absolutely simple. The steps of the proof are not hard, but for a senior in high school, you're going to have to take them through it a little bit, 1 step at a time. But essentially, right, if you have an uncaused cause, as Thomas Aquinas said, an uncaused cause is going, and you need at least one of them, right? Because if everything is a caused cause out there, and a caused cause is awaiting causation to exist, then an infinite number of caused causes without an uncaused cause is still awaiting causation to exist, in which case it's nothing, and you would be nothing. So you need at least one uncaused cause. And then Thomas relentlessly goes through, right? He just, what's an uncaused cause? It has to be an act of existing through itself. And it has to be a pure act of existing through itself. Of course, anything then which is different from the uncaused, so anything which could be a boundary or a restriction to an uncaused cause would have to be different from the pure act of existing through itself, in which case it doesn't exist through itself, which means it has to be caused. Existence must precede essence. And when the kids, they can get it. You can take them through it, they can get it. And once they see that an uncaused cause as a pure act of existing through itself can't have any restriction or boundary internally or externally, they see what that means with respect to space and time. Honestly, these kids go, well, if it has no restriction, I said, that's right. You can't divide it. You can't. What does every single complex require? What's entailed by complexity? Parts. But if you have no restrictions, right, what do you need for parts? You've got to have some restrictions so that the parts can be less than the whole. But if you have no restrictions, you can't have any parts. If you don't have any parts, then this thing must be a pure act of existing through itself, which has no parts, no space, no time, no external dimensions. All it is pure power itself to exist. That's all it is. What is it? Absolutely simple. Now we take Dawkins' second premise and finish the deal. If more complexity is more improbable, then a being which is absolutely simple would have to be, absence of complexity, would have to be the most probable being of all. Thank you, Dawkins, for that proof of God. The point I'm trying to get to very clearly is these things can be responded to. This tool does it. The kids know, right? They watch Big Bang Theory. They watch all that stuff. Okay. We have Stephen Barr was very kind to be the host or the science host on a documentary called Cosmic Origins. Can also get that on the website, magiscenter.com. There's a store there. I didn't bring these things. But on that Cosmic Origins documentary, we interview 7 world-class physicists. I think you've heard of many of them. Owen Gingerich, certainly. Arno Penzias, who won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of the 2.7 degree Kelvin uniformly distributed radiation, which was kind of a proof of the Big Bang. And then also John Polkinghorne, who I think many of you have read John's books. Of course, Stephen was the host on it, explaining many of these things. Jennifer Weissman was on it, and so forth. So essentially, it's a good credibility builder, and it's a good imagination builder. Because the good part about this documentary is it does provoke the imagination to think beyond the physical world. And there's this wonderful little line where Owen Gingerich at the end, who's an astronomer from Harvard University, at the end he looks at me and he says, well, I can't give a definitive proof of God from physics. But I'm psychologically incapable of believing that God is not present in this utterly rational universe. And so I prefer to call this universe God's universe. Now, you just look at that from somebody who's kind of a granddaddy of astronomy at Harvard, and there's something there. It's a credibility thing, but it's an imagination thing. It's a great video, and like I said, Stephen, I think, does a great job in hosting it, and I think, he's got a career, So the long and the short of it is we also have more complex things. We have this book, New Proofs. We also have, the study guides and so forth for the various books. So there's a lot of resources there. Importantly for the kids, if you go to magiscenter.com, hit the Faith and Science landing page there. There's a free video. It's 2 hours, I know, but it goes through everything. BVG, goes through near-death experiences, entropy, fine-tuning coincidence, all free. It's all free. Just click on the free video, and they can see the entire thing from start to finish. There's podcasts there. Do the same thing in little chunks of 12 minutes each, 12 podcasts and so forth. So you can get a lot of free material there, and so you might want to send the kids there just as a primer. Last but not least, parents. Some religion teachers are not going to want to show these things to their students, and I'll talk about why that is in a moment. But I think if they could just recommend to the parents that the parents sit down and watch the Reason series with their kids together, right? It's 5 DVDs. There's a workbook. Just to watch it together and look at it. Then you don't have to overcome the intimidation of science. In going out to the science teachers, we've been going to a lot of dioceses, trying to get the dioceses to work with us. We've discovered 2 things about the high school religion teachers and faith and science. Number one, if you say the word science, and they don't have a background in it, they're not going to use it. They're very scared of dealing with something that they don't have a real control over. We're trying to rectify that right now by, I do webcasts. So what I'm trying to do is set up webcasts with science teachers, right? Come one, come all. So if you've got high schools out there and you've got a lot of skeptical science teachers, don't believe a thing, you know, everyone's welcome. Come onto the webcast. We try to answer as many questions as we can, you know, on these issues, you know, and then try to get a few of those science teachers to go into and help the religion teachers to do the faith and science. Because, right, I mean, it is going to take basically an 8-day commitment from them to get through all 5 discs and some discussion and everything. But what we're hoping is that the school will support that with some kind of a stipend to give to the science teacher to go in there and help the religion teacher to do this. It's going to take maybe 2 science teachers per school to get that done, but I think it's a very, very good way of doing it. The other thing that we're discovering is there are some people who, honestly, inertia kills. And we're discovering that a lot of teachers don't want to do something new. We even have a happiness, suffering, and the love of God curriculum. 4 levels of happiness. Why would God allow suffering, right? Why, do we have a soul? Things like that, which the religion teachers really could teach. There's still inertia there, and they're scared of trying something new. So we're trying to figure out a way that we can work with the 6 big major publishers of the curricula to try and get people to accept some what's called supplementary curricula. So I'm writing to Bishop Bricken and to Bishop Blair and just asking if I can have some time so we can get some of these faith and science curricula. Chris Baglow, too. I speak for everything. We work with iTest. That's the Institute for Theological Encounter with Science and Technology. We work with iTest. They do kind of grade school things, and we do the high school things on faith and science. But we need just a little approval from the bishops, and I think we can really go far. I know I went over time. I apologize, but I will now go ahead and try and take your questions. Thank you very, very much for your kind attention. Shirley?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, I appreciate your book that you wrote as well on the proofs. I do have actually kind of 2 questions.
Sure.
One, my background personally is not in physics, it's in chemistry and biology. But, so I've got 2 questions, as I said. One has to do more with metaphysics. The other has to do with physics.
Yeah.
With regard to the metaphysical question, how do we account for miracles? And I guess what I mean by that is, well, would we say that really that the natural order is suspended, or that the natural order, in a sense, continues to exist, and somehow a supernatural order kind of comes in and works that is consistent with, as opposed to inconsistent with, the natural order?
Yeah, well, right now, you've got the 2 options. I don't know of anyone who has answered that question yet. I mean, obviously, if the whole universe is, if I can use an analogy, a thought in God's unrestricted act of understanding itself, then God can do anything he wants in his thought. And so could he suspend natural laws in that thought of the universe? Yes. Or in the thought of a multiverse? Sure. No problem. Could he also work within the laws of nature? As Stephen pointed out this morning, there's ample room to do so because, right, I mean, basically the smallest time unit you have is 10 to the minus 42nd seconds. So in order for physical activity to do something is going to require at least that amount of time in the general theory of relativity. So if that were the case, could, as it were, God work within that very, very small, but nonetheless finitely small interval? Yes, certainly could. Could he do it in ways imperceived by human beings? Absolutely. So does God suspend natural laws? I don't know. Stephen may have a better answer to this. Does he work through natural laws? Don't know. But both options, are possible.
And then the second question actually does have to do with the Planck era and the entropy question. And I'm just curious. I mean, I wonder what modern physicists are thinking about entropy during the Planck era. So, for instance, if we have like a past extended Big Bang theory with an oscillating universe, is it possible that during, that small period that somehow maybe the second law of thermodynamics is somehow reversed, where entropy, in fact, gets very small?
Yeah, there's I take that question up specifically in chapter 1 of this book. There's an atheist by the name of Sean Carroll who actually believes that will not work. And he puts it together in a very fine argument called No Bounds. And essentially what he holds is that, right, so you have, let's take the Penrose number, right, 10 to the 10 to the 123 to 1 against the low entropy of our universe, right? So we have approximately, let's suppose there are 10 to the 80th baryons in our universe. And let's suppose that the entropy per baryon is 10 to the 43. So 10 to the 80th times 10 to the 43 is 10 to the 123. And then you take the exponential, because it'd be the logarithm to get to the entropy, but the exponential of the entropy turns out to be the phase space options for our universe, that possible ones that there could be, which is 10 to the 10 to the 123, different possible, let's call them possible universes that could have arose, the vast majority of which would have high entropy or disorder. Now, Sean Carroll, being aware of this, right, he says, okay, then every previous cycle, right, because remember, in every single cycle, the entropy is going to increase, right? And not just because of universal expansion, but as Roger Penrose and Jacob Bekenstein discovered, right, entropy also continues in a universal collapse. And if this guy, Willie Banks, if he is correct, then it actually, if in a universal collapse, you could actually go to what's called a black crunch. Essentially, the entire universe could reach thermodynamic equilibrium as the universe was moving toward a singularity. And then finally, as it moves to something fundamental, it just is extinguished. It becomes a maximum entropy, which is incapable of doing anything. Now, let's suppose, that Banks and Fowler are not right. But Roger Penrose is most assuredly right about entropy continuing in a collapse and even in a black hole. If that's correct, then every previous cycle, as Sean Carroll would say, this is the atheist, right? He would say every previous cycle would be even more improbable than 10 to the 10 to the 123 to 1. And then the next cycle before it would even be more improbable. And of course, he says you get to the point where if you have infinite time, you have infinite fine-tuning of the universe, which, of course, is right there is a proof of God, which Sean Carroll's not going to admit to. So he essentially rejects it. But there's a wonderful little quote in there, and the Banks and, I said Banks and Fowler, Banks and Fisher, critique is also there in chapter 1.
Friends, we have to cut it off there because we don't have infinite time, but we do have infinite appreciation. So thank you.